I still remember the first night I stepped into the Lincoln bedroom. The air seemed heavier there, not suffocating, but thick with something unexplainable. I'm not one for ghosts or superstition, but I'm also not blind to my surroundings. That room carried a presence, one that lingered just out of reach, like a shadow you could sense even with your eyes shut. It was the middle of my first term as President of the United States. We had just moved into the White House, the culmination of decades of public service and hard-fought battles. My family and I were still getting used to the grand halls and the endless staff buzzing about. There was an unspoken rule that certain parts of the house held secrets best left untouched, but no one spoke about it directly. The Lincoln bedroom was one of those places. At first, it was just an unused room, another museum-like relic of the White House's storied past. But after weeks of formal dinners, cabinet meetings, and the constant pressure of the job, I decided I needed a change. The grandeur of the presidential suite had begun to feel stifling, too symbolic of the role I was still trying to grow into. So I made the impulsive decision to move into the Lincoln bedroom, thinking it might give me some clarity, some connection to the legacy of the office I now held. That night, as I unpacked a few personal items to make the space feel like my own, I noticed how quiet it was. Not the comfortable silence of a library or the soft hush of a distant breeze, but a silence that felt unnatural. The kind that makes you check over your shoulder even though you know no one's there. The ornate four-poster bed stood at the center of the room, its rich mahogany frame almost too perfect, too polished, as if daring anyone to disturb its perfection. I settled in, tired but restless, flipping through some briefing papers before eventually turning off the bedside lamp. The room plunged into darkness, but the quiet wasn't soothing. It was unnerving. Lying there, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around 2 a.m., I woke up with a start. At first, I thought it was the stress of the job getting to me, another nightmare about the economy or a contentious foreign policy decision. But this wasn't the kind of dread that comes from the mind. It was physical. My chest felt tight, and there was an unmistakable chill in the air, one that had crept in despite the state-of-the-art heating system. That's when I saw it. The faint outline of a man standing near the window, his back turned to me. His figure was unmistakable, tall and lean, with broad shoulders draped in what looked like a long coat. The moonlight poured in from the window, illuminating the room in a soft glow, but it didn't touch him. I froze, unsure if I was awake or dreaming. I blinked hard, but he didn't vanish. He stood there, motionless, staring out the window. My breath caught in my throat as I struggled to summon the courage to speak. "Who's there?" I managed, my voice breaking the silence like a crack of thunder. The figure didn't turn around, but I heard it then, the faintest whisper, as if the walls themselves were speaking. "This house bears the weight of unfinished work." My heart pounded as I reached for my phone, only to realize it was on the nightstand, just out of reach. I didn't dare move. The figure shifted slightly, his profile now visible. It was then I recognized him, not from any recent memory, but from history books, portraits, and endless stories. Abraham Lincoln. The figure faded slowly, dissolving into the shadows as though he'd never been there at all. The room was still, but the air was heavier than ever. I stayed awake until morning, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. The next morning, I forced myself to act normal, though every step I took in the White House felt different. It wasn't fear exactly, but a nagging awareness that the walls held more than just history. At breakfast, my partner noticed my unease. "You barely touched your coffee," they said, studying me with that concerned look I'd grown familiar with. "Rough night." "Something like that," I replied, attempting a weak smile. I didn't want to share what I'd seen. Not yet. I couldn't risk sounding unhinged. The pressures of the presidency were enough without anyone thinking I'd lost my grip on reality. I turned my attention to the briefings for the day. Meetings with advisors, calls with foreign leaders, and a press conference filled my schedule, but my mind kept drifting back to the figure in the bedroom. His words, faint as they were, echoed in my head. This house bears the weight of unfinished work. That night, I decided to stay in the Lincoln bedroom again. I needed to convince myself that what I'd seen was nothing more than a trick of the light, a product of exhaustion. I told myself that great leaders must have their moments of doubt and vulnerability. It was a test of resolve, nothing more. The room felt different as I entered, though. The air carried a chill that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I adjusted the thermostat, trying to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the faint patterns in the wallpaper, wondering if they'd been there during Lincoln's time. Around midnight, the disturbances began. The sound of footsteps echoed faintly down the hallway outside the door, even though the Secret Service kept that area secured. Then came the whispers, faint and disjointed, like fragments of a conversation spoken through a wall. I pressed my ear against the bedroom door, but as soon as I did, the noises stopped. When I turned back to the room, I froze. The antique clock on the mantel, a piece that had been silent for decades, was chiming. Its haunting melody reverberated through the room, each chime sending a shiver down my spine. And then I saw them, not just one figure, but three. They stood near the bed, their forms faint but undeniable. Lincoln was among them, his tall frame commanding attention, but the other two were strangers, at least at first glance. One was a young woman dressed in a plain gown, her face pale and gaunt, as if she'd endured unspeakable hardship. The other was a man in a soldier's uniform, his expression grim, his chest bearing the emblem of the Union Army. Couldn't breathe, let alone move. The young woman's voice broke the silence, soft but filled with pain. "Do you see us now?" she asked, her gaze piercing mine. What do you want?" I stammered. The soldier stepped forward, his boots making no sound on the carpeted floor. His voice was steady but carried the weight of decades. "We don't want. We need justice, recognition. From me," I asked, my voice cracking under the weight of their stares. Lincoln's deep voice filled the room, calm yet commanding. "From the office you hold, from the power you wield. This house remembers everything. The sacrifices, the betrayals, the unfinished promises. You must carry it forward." The young woman stepped closer, and I could see the tears in her ghostly eyes. "We were forgotten," she whispered. "Our stories buried, our pain erased. But you can change that." Before I could respond, they vanished, leaving behind a silence more oppressive than any noise. I fell back onto the bed, trembling, my mind reeling from what I'd just experienced. Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, it was filled with visions of war, hardship, and suffering I couldn't escape. The next day, I sought answers. I pulled aside the White House historian, a sharp and meticulous woman who had spent her life uncovering the secrets of the residents. "Do you believe in the stories?" I asked her, trying to sound casual. She hesitated, studying me. "Stories, Mr. President?" "The hauntings," I clarified. "Lincoln, the others." She leaned in slightly, her voice lowering. "I don't believe, sir." "I know. The Lincoln bedroom has been the site of too many incidents to dismiss. But it's not just Lincoln. The White House has witnessed centuries of history, much of it painful, much of it unresolved. It's said that those who suffered the most leave a part of themselves behind." "Why now?" I asked. "Why me?" "You're the one in power," she said simply. "And maybe they think you'll listen." Over the weeks that followed, the hauntings intensified. Staff members reported cold spots, flickering lights, and objects moving on their own. One housekeeper quit on the spot after seeing a man in a stovepipe hat walking down the hallway. The whispers grew louder, often carrying fragments of phrases that hinted at historical wrongs. The land taken, the promises broken, the blood spilled. Then came the event that shook the White House to its core. It was during a formal state dinner in the East Room. As I stood at the podium, addressing dignitaries and heads of state, the chandeliers began to sway. The room grew cold, the kind of cold that grips your bones. Before I could say another word, a sharp gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the candles on the tables. And then they appeared. Not just Lincoln and the two figures I'd seen before, but dozens more. Soldiers, enslaved people, women and children. Their translucent forms filled the room, their faces a mixture of sorrow and anger. Gasps and screams erupted from the crowd as the spirits began to speak, their voices overlapping in a chilling symphony. "You must remember us," they said. "Do not let us be forgotten." I stood frozen, unable to respond, unable to move. It wasn't until Lincoln stepped forward, his face inches from mine, that I found my voice. "What do you want me to do?" I whispered. "Lead," he said. "Not just for today, but for tomorrow. Acknowledge what was done. Make it right." And with that, they disappeared, leaving the room in stunned silence. The dinner was only the beginning of the chaos. Word of the incident spread quickly, despite the Secret Service's best efforts to contain it. Officially, we called it a freak electrical malfunction combined with a draft from old ventilation ducts. Unofficially, I knew the truth, and so did the staff who'd witnessed it. But the horrors didn't stay confined to the East Room. They followed us, the shadows in the hallways late one night. As I made my way back to the Lincoln bedroom after a grueling meeting, the hallways felt wrong, elongated, darker than usual, even with the overhead lights. My footsteps echoed unnaturally, as though I were walking through an empty cathedral rather than the heart of the White House. I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the hallway, quick and deliberate. My instincts kicked in and I called out, "Who's there?" No answer. I continued forward, my heartbeat a drum in my ears. As I passed the entrance to the Roosevelt Room, I saw it again, this time clearer. A figure crouched in the corner, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its eyes glowed faintly in the darkness, reflecting the dim light like a predator in the woods. "Show yourself," I demanded, my voice trembling. The thing stood, its movements jerky and wrong, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. It didn't speak but pointed toward the Lincoln bedroom. Then, in a flash, it vanished, leaving behind only the faint smell of burnt wood and something metallic, like blood. When I reached my room, the door was ajar. Inside, the temperature was freezing, and my breath came out in visible puffs. The bed, once perfectly made, was now unkempt, the sheets twisted and pulled to the floor. On the mirror above the dresser, a single phrase was etched in frost: "You cannot ignore us." In the days that followed, I noticed something unnerving about the portraits hanging throughout the White House. They weren't just lifeless depictions of past presidents and first ladies anymore. It started with subtle changes. Thomas Jefferson's eyes seemed to follow me as I walked past his painting in the Blue Room. George Washington's expression, normally stoic, looked strained, almost accusatory. One night, while reviewing documents in the Oval Office, I glanced at a small portrait of Abraham Lincoln that hung on the far wall. Something was off. His posture was different, slumped, his head bowed as if in mourning. I stared at it for what felt like hours, convincing myself it was a trick of the light. Then, slowly, his head turned. His eyes met mine, filled with a sorrow so profound it felt like a physical blow. I stumbled back, knocking over a chair, and the portrait returned to its original state, unmoving and silent. But the message was clear. The spirits were growing impatient. One evening, desperate for fresh air and clarity, I wandered into the rose garden. It was quiet, the way it always is at night, with only the sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. For a moment, I felt at peace, disconnected from the oppressive weight of the Lincoln bedroom and its ghosts. Then I heard them, voices, whispering at first, like the rustling of wind through the trees. But soon, they grew louder, overlapping, a cacophony of anguish and anger. I turned, searching for the source, but the garden was empty. The whispers became words, disjointed and fragmented. Lost, betrayed, blood in the soil, broken promises. The ground beneath my feet felt unsteady, as though the earth itself was shifting. I looked down and froze. The grass was withering before my eyes, turning brown and brittle, and from the cracks in the soil seeped a dark, sticky liquid that smelled unmistakably of iron. Before I could move, a hand shot out of the ground, skeletal and decayed, gripping my ankle with a force that sent me crashing to the ground. I screamed, kicking at the hand, but more followed. Dozens of hands clawed their way out of the earth, grasping at me, pulling me down. I fought with everything I had, clawing at the ground, screaming for help. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The hands were gone, the ground was solid again, and the grass was as green as ever. I stumbled back inside, shaken and covered in dirt, knowing I could no longer deny the truth. The most horrifying encounter came 3 nights later. I was alone in the Lincoln bedroom, trying to piece together a strategy to appease whatever was haunting us. Exhaustion weighed on me, but I couldn't bring myself to sleep. The room grew cold again, colder than before. My breath came out in heavy clouds, and the walls seemed to hum with a low, vibrating energy. And then they came, all of them, the room filled with spirits, men, women, children, soldiers, enslaved people. They stood in silent rows, their translucent forms flickering like weak flames. At the center was Lincoln, his face a mask of sorrow and resolve. "You must act," he said, his voice booming yet calm. "You cannot lead while ignoring the weight of this house, this country." The young woman from before stepped forward, her face streaked with spectral tears. "If you do nothing, you will join us here, bound to this place as we are. What do you want from me?" I shouted, my voice cracking under the weight of their collective gaze. The soldier answered this time, his voice like gravel. "Justice, truth, recognition, not for us, but for those who come after." The walls began to shake, and the air filled with a deafening roar. The spirits grew brighter, their forms burning with an unearthly light. I fell to my knees, covering my ears, but their voices pierced through the noise, their message clear. "You have the power. Use it." And just like that, they were gone. The room fell silent, but the echoes of their words lingered, pressing down on me like a physical weight. The White House wasn't just haunted anymore, it was alive, and it wasn't just confined to the Lincoln bedroom. The energy, the ghosts, the whispers, they were everywhere. Every corner of the residence felt charged, like a storm was constantly brewing just beneath the surface. I wasn't the only one affected. Staff began quitting without notice, their nerves frayed from constant unexplained occurrences. One chef refused to return to the kitchen after seeing the stove light itself and the faint outline of a woman stirring an invisible pot. A Secret Service agent, a hardened veteran, broke protocol and burst into my office one afternoon, his face pale as he stammered about hearing the Gettysburg Address echoing in the West Wing hallway. The worst, however, was the family. My partner had always been the steady one, the person who grounded me when the weight of the presidency felt unbearable. But even they were beginning to crack. One night, I found them sitting on the edge of our bed, their face pale and drawn. "I heard them," they said quietly, their voice trembling. "Heard who?" I asked, though I already knew. "The children," they whispered. They were crying, calling for their parents. I went to the hallway and they were there, standing in the shadows. They looked so real, but when I tried to touch them, they disappeared. The fear in their eyes broke something in me. Whatever this was, it wasn't just about me anymore. It was tearing apart the very people I loved. By the time the State of the Union address came around, I was barely holding it together. I'd spent weeks trying to understand what the spirits wanted from me, but their demands were vague, fragmented, tied to events and injustices I could barely comprehend. The night of the address, I stood backstage going over my speech. My advisors had crafted it carefully, a blend of optimism and policy, but I knew it lacked the gravity the moment required. As I stepped onto the stage, the applause of the assembled crowd rang in my ears. I looked out over the sea of faces: senators, representatives, military leaders, and guests, trying to muster the confidence to deliver the words I'd rehearsed 100 times. But then the lights flickered. It started subtly, just a momentary dimming that could have been written off as a technical glitch. But then they flickered again, longer this time, casting eerie shadows across the chamber. The murmurs began, a low hum of confusion spreading through the crowd. And then the voices started. At first, they were faint, overlapping whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. But as they grew louder, it became clear they weren't just random murmurs. They were words, phrases, sentences, spoken by voices filled with pain and anger. "Do not forget us. Our blood built this nation. The promises were broken. Justice for all, not just the chosen few." The crowd was visibly shaken, many looking around in confusion, others frozen in their seats. Behind me, the grand painting of George Washington seemed to warp, his stoic expression shifting into something unrecognizable, anguished, furious. A crack split the air, and one of the chamber's towering columns trembled as if it might collapse. I gripped the podium, my hands trembling as I tried to steady myself. This cannot continue," I began, my voice faltering. "Whatever is happening here, it must stop." But the spirits didn't stop. They intensified, their forms flickering into view like static on an old television. Lincoln appeared in the center aisle, his figure more solid than ever before. He didn't speak this time, but his presence was enough to silence the entire chamber. The ghosts filled the room, enslaved people, soldiers from both sides of the Civil War, women in mourning clothes, children clutching tattered toys. They stared at the gathered leaders, their faces a blend of sorrow and accusation. One voice cut through the chaos, clear and commanding. "The truth must be told. The past cannot be erased." In the days that followed, the hauntings reached a fever pitch. Lights exploded, objects moved on their own, and staff refused to enter certain parts of the building. The entire White House felt like a ticking time bomb, and I knew I had to find answers before it was too late. The White House historian, the only person who seemed willing to discuss the hauntings openly, suggested something radical. "There are parts of the White House that haven't been touched in decades," she said, her voice low. "The basement holds records, artifacts, things most people have forgotten. If the spirits are tied to history, maybe the answers are down there." The idea of descending into the basement alone wasn't appealing, but I was desperate. Late that night, armed with nothing but a flashlight and my resolve, I made my way down the narrow stairs into the bowels of the White House. The air was damp and cold, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. Rows of old boxes and cabinets stretched out before me, filled with yellow documents and artifacts that hadn't seen daylight in decades. As I rifled through the papers, I found it. A ledger, bound in cracked leather, its pages filled with meticulous handwriting. It detailed the construction of the White House, the workers who built it, and the lives that were lost in the process. Many of those workers were enslaved people, their names recorded without dignity, their contributions reduced to numbers. But it wasn't just the ledger. There were letters, diaries, and photographs, each one telling a story of pain, loss, and injustice. The air grew colder as I read, and I realized I wasn't alone. The spirits were there, watching, waiting. "You've seen it now," one of them whispered. "Will you carry it forward?" I emerged from the basement clutching the ledger, its brittle pages trembling in my hands. My mind reeled from the weight of what I'd read. Those names, those stories, they were the voices I'd been hearing. They were the hands that clawed at me, the shadows in the hallways, the ghosts pleading for justice. Back in the Lincoln bedroom, I spread the contents of the ledger across the desk. The stories weren't just tragic. They were damning. The foundation of this house, this nation, was soaked in the sweat and blood of people who had been erased from history. As I pored over the documents, the room grew colder. A faint whisper filled the air, growing louder and louder until it became a chorus of voices, overlapping and urgent. "This is the truth," they said. "What will you do with it?" Before I could respond, the room shook violently. The chandelier swayed, its crystals jingling like wind chimes in a storm. The paintings on the walls tilted as if the house itself was rebelling against my silence. Then, the figure of Abraham Lincoln appeared once more, this time solid enough to cast a shadow on the floor. "You cannot lead with blind eyes," he said, his voice calm but filled with authority. "This house, this country, demands truth. You've seen the ledger. You've heard the voices. Now, what will you do?" "I don't know," I shouted, the weight of his words crushing me. "What can I do? How do I make this right?" Lincoln stepped closer, his tall frame looming over me. "You cannot undo the past, but you can honor it. You can face it, acknowledge what was done, shine a light on the darkness." The following morning, a sense of calm settled over the White House. It was subtle, an absence of the cold drafts, the oppressive silence, and the unsettling whispers that had plagued every corner. The house felt lighter, as though it had exhaled a burden it had carried for centuries. But I knew better. This was not the end. It was the beginning. The spirits had made their message clear. My actions were not just about honoring their pain, but about forging a path that would ensure no one else would bear the same forgotten scars. I called an emergency meeting with my closest advisors, my voice steady despite the weight of what I was about to say. "We're going to do something unprecedented. We're going to face the truth." My team exchanged nervous glances. "What truth, Mr. President?" my chief of staff asked cautiously. "This house, this country, has been built on sacrifices, on the backs of those whose stories were erased to protect a sanitized history. It's time we bring those stories to light. I need your help to do it." That evening, I addressed the nation from the East Room, the same space where the spirits had once manifested in their full, terrifying glory. The cameras rolled, broadcasting my words to millions, and I felt their presence. Not the oppressive cold or the accusatory stares, but a quiet, watchful solidarity. "My fellow Americans," I began, my voice steady despite the enormity of what I was about to say. We often celebrate the triumphs of our nation without acknowledging the full truth of its history. This house, the White House, stands as a symbol of freedom and democracy. But it is also a monument to the untold stories of those who labored, sacrificed, and suffered to make it what it is today. I held up the ledger I'd found in the basement, its cracked leather binding visible under the harsh studio lights. This ledger contains the names of men and women, many of them enslaved, who built this house. Their stories are not just footnotes in history. They are the foundation of our nation, and we owe them more than silence. The weight of my words hung in the air. Starting today, we will dedicate ourselves to uncovering and preserving these stories. We will build memorials, fund education initiatives, and ensure that every American, past and present, is honored for their contributions to our nation's legacy. I paused, feeling the eyes of both the living and the departed on me. We cannot undo the past, but we can face it, and in facing it, we can begin to heal. In the weeks that followed, the White House underwent a transformation, not of its structure, but of its spirit. The Lincoln bedroom became a space of education, its walls adorned with exhibits detailing the lives and stories of those who had built the residence. Visitors were no longer met with sanitized tours, but with honest accounts of the house's history, from the enslaved laborers who laid its foundation to the soldiers who defended its ideals. The nation, too, began to change. Schools incorporated the forgotten stories of the past into their curriculums. Memorials and plaques appeared in places long overlooked. People began to talk, not in hushed tones, but openly, about the truths that had been hidden for too long. One night, months later, I returned to the Lincoln bedroom alone. The air was still, no longer heavy with unspoken grief, but calm and peaceful. I sat on the edge of the bed, reflecting on everything that had happened. As I stood to leave, I felt it, a faint warmth on my shoulder, like a hand resting gently, reassuringly. I turned, but no one was there. Still, I knew. "Thank you," I whispered into the stillness. And though the room remained silent, I felt an undeniable sense of peace. The spirits had found their rest, and I had found my purpose. The Lincoln bedroom remained a focal point of the White House, but not for its hauntings. It became a symbol of reckoning, a space where the past and present met to inspire a better future. Visitors spoke of feeling a presence there, not cold or angry, but warm and comforting, as though the house itself was grateful for the truth finally being acknowledged. As I left office years later, I carried with me the lessons the spirits had imparted. Leadership isn't about avoiding the weight of history, but about carrying it forward, no matter how heavy it may be. The past no longer haunted the White House. Instead, it stood as a guidepost, a reminder of what we owe to those who came before and what we must do for those yet to come.